I have a woefully undersubscribed subreddit, so please do me a favour. If you're a Redditor, head on over to r/postmortem studios and talk about anything related to any of my shenanigans. Peace.
Hello lovelies, so while I wait in a queue hoping to get a PS5, let's review and book through Dungeon of the Mad Mage. This is probably as close as you're going to get to an old school Gygaxian dungeon in 5th edition. It is insane, it is Gygaxian, and it is massive. I think the reason why that has been deemed okay in a modern game without too much revision is because of the mad part. I'm surprised they didn't get called out on that for ableism, quite frankly. It is a huge dungeon complex of the old school, or at least, as I say, as close as you're going to get to that in the modern era. It's a whopping 300 pages for a dungeon. You may or may not get particular use out of it. Part of the problem I think that we have today with modules is that so many groups online play the same modules and they stream them, and people want to play those modules in the same sort of way that they used to play through dungeons in MMOs, in that you repeat it. But the trouble is then you know a lot of the stuff. So if you're a games master and you know that your players do like to spend a little bit of time online watching streams of particular games, then you might want to switch things out, change things up, just to keep things surprising. So you start out with a nice sort of overall guide to the place, the levels, the basic descriptions, the kind of rewards and so on that you can expect or that you ought to give. Some ideas for quests. So one way you can approach this is you can have different quests requiring you to go to different parts of this gigantic mega dungeon rather than just delving for its own sake. It would also be a good setup, I think, for something akin to how to pick up girls in a dungeon. If you wanted to take a more sort of anime fantasy kind of spin on it. It doesn't waste too much time though. It pretty much gets right into it, and you will find maps of each level, all 20 levels. You'll find descriptions of everything there, you'll find monsters there. What would have been nice, actually, weirdly, in this would have been to have little boxes of white next to some of the main descriptions where you can make notes on what has happened there before, how you might want to switch things up, alternative versions of some of the rooms or the traps. That would have bloated the book, but I think it would have been useful and given it more replayability and more use to get into it. So obviously the higher levels, depending which way you want to count, levels 1, 2, 3, they're lower level, and then the deeper ones are more dangerous as you go on. There are machinations and plots between the various factions that you find within the dungeon, but it doesn't seem to overly worry about that. It doesn't seem to pay too much attention to the necessities of all these creatures living in this dungeon. There's a sort of passing handwave interest, so it's part of the reason it's Gygaxian, and I guess since it is controlled and run by a Mad Mage, it's magic. Ain't gotta explain shit. Quite why all these monsters have ended up here, paid for or drawn by promises of power or whatever, it goes into that for some of the groups, some of the monsters, but the rest is just kind of left hanging as a bit of a mystery. The puzzles are a bit weird and a bit arbitrary. They don't necessarily make a great deal of sense, but again, mad. So there's your excuse. What? This doesn't make any sense. He's insane and he has magic. Hand wave. It's the sort of thing we used to have in dungeons before sort of pseudo-realism came in. One thing that is a bit different about it is a lot of adventures these days have kind of set-piece fights. So a dungeon might consist of a couple of guards, some puzzles, some rooms to explore, some loot to grab, and then some sort of final boss fight or whatever. And so modern, not even really dungeons, but modern published modules tend to be scenic fight, scenic fight, scenic fight strung together. Whereas this is more of an old school kick down the door, kill whatever's inside, loot everything, move on. But not entirely. There are touches of more modern game design and pseudo-realism or attempts at plausibility, just not so much as in the more modern modules. If you want to give someone an experience of more what an old school module was like, then this is certainly a useful resource for that. If you wanted to play the old school version of it, you can still pick up modules for older editions at Drive-Thru-RPG, and then you could just use some of the statistics and so on from this. It's not an exact correspondence one-to-one, but it's broadly, largely the same, or you can find statistics for the other things online or in your other books. So you could quite easily transpose this and use it as a resource for giving a genuine, 100% genuine old school experience. Well, at least as much as you can get with 5th edition, which allows you to heal rather rapidly. Many of the monsters are unlikely. Again, handwave, mad, mage. So, that's how it got there, probably. Or some random magical effect, or who knows what, really. But you don't necessarily feel the pressure to have an explanation or plausibility. Each level has its own theme, really. Some of these are stronger than others. Some of them make more sense than others. There are ways you can hook this massive Underdungeon into the Underdark as well. Some of them have mixed themes. The themes tend to become stronger and more important the lower you go into the dungeon. Of course, the question I have, really, is one of the ways into the dungeon is the yawning portal in Waterdeep, and given that's there, and given the sheer concentration of adventurers and guilds and the ease of accessibility to the dungeon, how is it that there is anything left in there? Yeah, even with a Mad Mage, there are limitations, and surely enterprising adventurers would have farmed this shit into the ground by now, so you would think. It is slightly less illustrated than other books in the sort of modern era of D&D, but it's got so much information to get across. Yeah, that makes sense. You can count maps as illustrations if you want, or not. There's also a theme running through a lot of the levels of dungeons within dungeons. Each level is almost a dungeon within a dungeon, and then within each level you may find mini dungeons related to particular themes or particular creatures. But you got to wonder how the Mad Mage restocks this place, really. Sub-maps would have been useful, like blowing out that section there on a page so you could get a better grasp, or battle maps or something for those individual areas. Unfortunately, you don't really get that. Again, that would have blown the book out, but maybe you could have done an additional supplement with the maps and things that you need. There's those book maps which are quite popular these days. That might have been an interesting thing to do. As it is, I'm sure plenty of people have made their own maps for these sections, which you can probably find online, I'm sure. So we're about 2/3 of the way through the book here, and there's not a lot I can really comment on the entries and the locations and so on without potentially spoiling, though I'm sure a lot of players will have already spoiled the game for themselves. But I can make a sort of generic criticism. A lot of old school games would open with a fairly decent description of each location as you got into it. This was useful as a games master because you had a set text which you could read out to the players. You didn't have to make the effort coming up with a description yourself. If the text felt that there needed to be a clue to something like a secret door or hidden items or whatever, it would often be within the text. And the florid descriptions were useful to learn how to describe your own dungeons. My own descriptive abilities, I think, were honed in part by the florid descriptions of places in fighting fantasy books and in early modules, though I didn't come till D&D until quite late. I didn't start with D&D. I started with MERP and a couple of other early games, but they followed the same format for adventures. So you would have a decent description of the place, and that helped give me my love of writing and description, and I think helped hone my skill in describing things, to the point where I'm never satisfied with my own descriptions of places, particularly. I'm a touch of hypocrisy here, I suppose. I don't write many adventures, and when I do, I don't necessarily go into it. But going through this, I got hit with nostalgia for the old modules, and really felt that something was really missing here. Let me try and find a non-particularly key description to show you what I mean. Okay, the Caves of Ooze. These should be resplendent with descriptions. Right? So here is the resplendent grotto of Icthulglug the Voluminous. And all it says is, this 50-foot high cavern contains the wreck of a cog, a 54-foot long cargo vessel with a single mast. The wreck's features are as follows. Blah, blah, blah. Very dry. Very, very dry indeed, and not particularly useful, helpful. It doesn't have that boost, that hook. It doesn't put you in the situation, in the place. It doesn't make you feel like you're there. So a better description might be a high-roofed cavern is waterlogged and filled with the wreckage of an old wooden merchant vessel. It's cracked in half, each half pointing towards the roof. Its mast is broken and tangled with old and rotting rope and cloth. The salty sea stink of a tide line issues forth from the remnants of the vessel. That's far more descriptive, and that's just off the top of my head there, but you could come up with something better, but there's nothing here for you other than very, very dry descriptions, and that's deeply unfortunate, I think. I mean, I can see, again, it cuts down on the amount of text that you have to put in here, but for newer games masters or ones who want to dip their toe into more Gygaxian dungeons, it's missing one of the vital elements of a lot of old school dungeons and modules in that it just lacks that description. So we're getting towards the end here, so let me just kind of wrap up. It's jarring because the old school material doesn't really fit with the new school rules particularly. It's missing a lot of what gave the old school modules their charm, and if you really wanted to do this properly, you could easily blow it out to 500 pages, adding the descriptions, adding the pop-out maps and a few combat maps of key locations and so on, and I think people would still have bought it for the experience. Mega dungeons were extremely trendy for a while. City of the Invincible Overlord, things like that. You could easily get away, particularly being wizards, for putting out a dungeon that was 500 pages. People would see that as a challenge, and it would create sort of community camaraderie around that. I think it would be a prestige product, sure, but it would have been a good way to chase old school interest and all the rest of it. Style wise, it is a bit short on the artwork, and a lot of the artwork is a bit muddy. It lacks the contrast and depth to draw you into the picture. This is particularly noticeable when so many of the pictures are smaller here. It lacks particularly usable maps, but it does have everything you need all within here. It's just presented in a particularly dry way. The artwork you can forgive because they need to save space, but the text I can't really forgive. For an experienced games master, that's not going to be a huge problem, but for newer games masters, that is going to be a bit of a problem, and it's going to negatively impact your experience running the dungeon and the experience of others in playing through the dungeon. So I can't give it more than a 3 for style. In terms of substance, most of it's there, and everything you need is there, but it lacks that sense of full completeness, in that it doesn't have a lot of the tools and extra information that you'd need. It just has what you need. It doesn't go beyond that. So in terms of substance, it is a substantive book, it is a substantive dungeon, but dungeons really lack a lot of replayability, even when you've got a Mad Mage and can handwave everything. So I'm going to give it a 4 for substance, barely, purely on the sheer scale of the thing. So that's 3 for style, 4 for substance, 7 out of 10, 3.5 out of 5. Yeah, above average, but really lacks replayability, and for such a big book, that's a huge shame. Zang. Old Fat Punks is part caper, part comedy, part nostalgia, and part commentary. It follows 3 aging punks as they build themselves up for one big, nihilistic last hurrah. You can buy Old Fat Punks at Amazon, Drive-Thru Fiction, or Lulu.com. Follow the links below or search on those sites.